Yeah, total eclipse really makes you, I believe, in a divine force in this sense. I mean, what are the odds that the sun, by the modern explanation, is exactly in the right distance so that it covers it up completely? You know what I mean? The odds of that, it's just like unimaginable. I mean, how lucky are we? Uh, it seems to me the divine force would be much easier to believe that it wasn't just a coincidence, a very, very, very odd coincidence.
I think that's a very good argument, Phil, for the idea that the moon was constructed. You know,
For our convenience.
it's an artificial body, was made
Okay.
exactly that size.
Oh,
As you can tell, all the craters are too close to the same diameter and
that's right.
width and depth.
That's
You
right.
know, yeah, clearly it's an
That turns off the
artificial.
camera.
Well, that sounds like Star Wars. The Empire Strikes Back, man.
Phil, just go to your local skeptics meeting and unload a few of these on them. Who knows? You might be right.
You know,
it's that funny thing, the moon was at a different distance from the Earth,
That's
a
right.
few billion years ago.
That's right.
It's we just happen to be at the right moment when we're looking up and things match up exactly the way we want them to. But a few billion years from now, they won't match up again, right? It'll be a little further away, and
Well, humanity will be gone, you know. The dinosaurs did not believe in God. I mean, like that the moon did not match the sun.
I think there's a lot of people who fantasize about uploading their consciousness into a computer as a way of living forever. I know other people who fantasize about maybe we're just a year or two away from curing death, and then they'll be able to live forever. I know a guy who he just won't stop talking about it. That's his big thing is, oh my God, I don't want to die, and I'm sure science is going to fix this problem any moment now. Because we're like gods now. We're so smart. We can do almost anything. It's just sure.
Is he
that's
working on the
my problem.
telomeres?
Cure for death. That's right. That's right.
Is he working on the telomeres? Because aging, if you can stop aging, then maybe you can stop death. And aging starts in that process of meiosis and mitosis. The telomeres. The telomeres shorten as you get older and older, and that's why your hair turns gray. That's why your face gets wrinkled.
Yeah,
that's why you join
the current line of thinking. But the problem is that there's also investigation that's going on that suggests that there are whole sets of genes in our bodies that activate only after we die. Do you know? Have you read about that?
No.
You should Google that. Evidently there's a significant part of our genetic code that has to do with taking us apart after we die, and it gets working the moment we die, and all those genes turn on. And with their sort of last bit of energy, all these cells start disassembling themselves.
Oh, the ones that control putrefaction. But you know what I have seen, which is pretty amazing? I've seen one case of progeria, and that is fantastic. It's not fantastic for the kid.
Well, no.
But
as a scientific thing.
Yes.
Yes. Does everybody know what she's referring to? Tell them, Sharon.
Oh, progeria is when a kid ages prematurely. So when you're 10 years old, you're like 100. When you're 7 years old, you're like 70, and you look like 70 or 60, and you get all the associated diseases.
Yeah.
Right? And that's a genetic abnormality.
Yeah.
And it was the kid that I saw, it was a spontaneous mutation, and it was very sad because you have the mind of a kid, not the mind of an adult. There's no knowledge and experience. There's no time to develop rationality, Stephen. Right.
At age 6, like a 60-year-old body.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
No. Rationality begins its role at a fairly early stage,
but only a little at first. It grows.
Yes.
Okay.
It's a process. It's a process. It's understanding, and you have to have process, and then you develop knowledge, and maybe
risk of boring you. When I was about 3 years old, my parents were trying to unload Santa Claus on me, and I was suspicious that I was being led on. And they told me he came down the chimney. So I grabbed newspaper and I stuffed up the chimney hole with newspaper. and figured out now he can't get in, therefore that disproves that Santa exists. Is that rational? No. It just shows at a very early phase, a kid can come up with some really irrational propositions, and we're trained to be rational. We don't start out.
That's not rational. You did an experiment and you came up with a deduction, with a conclusion. There's nothing rational about that.
That's empirical.
Well, if I'm preventing Santa from manifesting himself, is that really disproving his existence?
No.
Exactly. But I, at the time,
You thought it was
the case.
Yes. Well, now I've got that image in my head of little 3-year-old Stephen, who's looking skeptically at his parents' claims about Santa Claus and going, let's just see about that, shall we?
No, that was instinct, because when I can consciously remember back to when I was 5 months old.
5 months old.
The instincts are fantastic. That when there's just a perception back then that you can just know things without going through the process.
Right.
Like, for example, when I was about 6 months old, my dad was taking a photo of me with one of those sort of out bellows cameras. And I had seen him associate photos which I saw could fit in the back of the camera. And so I figured somehow the image was coming through the aperture of the camera and creating the photo.
Directly. Yeah.
And
I still like the best thing about Santa Claus is when the Marx Brothers did it. You know, Groucho is running around because he's looking at a contract and he's looking at the sanity clause. He's screaming like, well, what about the sanity clause? The sanity clause, he's running all around telling people. And finally, Chico says, come on, we know there's no such thing as a sanity clause.
Oh, God. Well, on all these notes, why don't we launch into our Kenneth Smith for today? So mostly we're done with paragraph 7, but we're going to go into paragraph 8, but I just want to emphasize a couple of terms that we talked about last week. And one of them is self-provident. Self-provident. Yes. And this is the things that come so easily to every species except us. It comes so difficult to us. So many of us are the opposite of self-provident. We're self-destructive, we're self-wasting. And this goes hand in hand with this issue that he talks about here of culture and reason. Culture and reason. You know, if self-providence is not instinctual to Homo sapiens, you know, if our instincts, we have a smaller number of instincts and they're more abstract. They set us up for things like wanting to imitate, wanting to speak, things like that. You know, these don't have anything to do with, if you spend time around cats, you see they can't help themselves. If a bird flutters by the window or a butterfly flutters or a little fly lands on the floor next to them, they can't look away. They can't do it. They're riveted. Their instincts grab them and say, look, it's a small, helpless, frightened thing, and it's moving in an enticing manner. You know, all of your hunter instincts need to be engaged, right? Their self-providence depends upon their fascination. And, you know, human beings are not fascinated by the things we need to survive. We're fascinated by, it could be almost anything that a person is fascinated by. And many of the things we're fascinated by are self-destructive for us. It's bad that we're fascinated by those things. So there is this issue where other species naturally mature into self-providence with a little bit of help, you know, from the parenting. I'm not saying there's no cultural or rational element to other animals, but I'm saying it's a lot easier for them because they've got that group of instincts that help to push them in the direction they ought to be going. We don't, and so we're utterly dependent on the combination of culture and reason. We need our culture to set examples for us to imitate that are healthy and lead us towards self-provident behavior. And we need reason to be able to help think our way out of some of the nonsense that we get ourselves into, to be able to solve problems that are not immediately instinctively, you know, obvious to us. And of course, our problem here is that the way that the terms culture and reason are defined in the modern world they don't necessarily guarantee any self-providence, right? What we call a culture, like an American culture, most of it has to do with, the carnival of the market, which is, consumers go out and and they get swindled by con men who run the markets. So the fool and his money are soon parted. This is not just a figure of speech. This is the life that most of us live. That we're constantly having to labor to generate money, and the money's being bled away from us, relentlessly. This that passes for a culture, if it's not leading us to be self-provident, is it actually a culture? Right? We go to the Merriam-Webster problem about dictionaries. Do words mean only what people say they mean? So if I don't know what a word means and I think it means something else and I convince everybody that that's what it means, did the word's meaning change? Right? And part of the reference here, the question here is, do words have any relationship to reality? Do we think that reality changes if I misunderstand reality? If I think that I'm going to live forever, ipso facto, am I suddenly able to live forever? This issue of how much is determined by our will or our group decisions, and how much is determined by nature itself, whether we like it or not, this is something moderns really struggle with. And so we have this problem around the words culture and reason. We think that if we call something a culture, it is a culture. Even if it doesn't lead people towards self-providence, the fact that we call it a culture, we think makes it a culture. So there's a modern definition of culture, which is, whatever people do, that's their culture. And likewise around reason, and this is what Stephen was sort of alluding to. What is the definition of reason and rationality? What are these things? And when you read Aristotle and the other Greeks, you could see them struggling to distinguish, random gibberish that your brain might be doing from sound, prudent, wise, judicious evaluation of what's real and what we ought to do. Sophrosune is a term that crops up a lot in Heraclitus and Aristotle. Sophrosune, which is where they're trying to talk about this combination of experience and taste and judgment and reason that's required to lead us towards self-provident behavior and choices, rather than, ideological attachment to things that destroy us, which in English, the word reason can't make a distinction between these things. It's reason is when you do brain stuff, right? I mean, thinking is brainy stuff. And there's really not a lot more clarity to the word than that. The idea of distinguishing good brainy stuff from bad brainy stuff, we just sort of try to sweep that under the rugs, crazy, insane. But then we have all these legal definitions of sanity that from the perspective of another culture might be considered insane. We say, well, this is sane behavior. And, the Greeks might look at it and go, that's absolutely crazy. You're not reasoning in a self-provident way. Ipso facto, it's a kind of madness, even though you all define it as sanity. So we have these problems. And we come back to this theme over and over, that the core words we need to make the critical discriminations between what works and what doesn't work, what's healthy and what's not healthy. In English and in modernity in general, there is a prejudice against making those kinds of distinctions, and there's a prejudice against insisting upon them. You're considered a troublemaker. You get called what's the term in linguistics? Prescriptivist. Nothing's worse than a prescriptivist. You're trying to tell people what words mean, and you're not allowed to do that. Words mean whatever we say they mean. So there's a struggle here around trying to get moderns to focus on issues of self-providence versus self-destruction. But what's the recurring theme here between paragraphs 7 and 8 is this issue of how dependent we are upon genuine culture, not what a modern calls a culture, and genuine reason or rationality, not what a modern calls reason or rationality, to help complete the unfinished picture that's left to us by our evolution, so that we can develop in a self-provident direction to try to compensate for this weakness that we evolved into. It's the critical issue here. Can we overcome this gap or defect in our in our evolution to put back what was lost. When we developed our creativity and our reason, we lost a whole bunch of things that used to make our ancestors, our distant ancestors, more self-provident than we are. And that means we both have opportunities and threats that they didn't have. So this is what this is all about. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, as you mentioned this thing about self-providence, I'm wondering whether human beings or mankind, as it developed, is in some sense because of our brain capacity, our mental development, is fascinated by so many things that we have to eliminate certain things in order to be, otherwise it's just beyond our brain capacity. We know that in contemporary neuropsychology that at certain age, I mean, when children grow, the first thing you want to do is really activate the nervous system, so they develop all sorts of things. So the neurons begin to blossom and grow, like 10,000 flowers bloom, so to speak. But at a certain point, I don't know, maybe about 6, I don't know. I'm not deep enough into that to say. That becomes a very, very important development in which you prune back to develop the garden, so to speak, to prune back certain things that, for whatever reason, is not used, so you could save the capacity for other developments in some sense. And it seems to me that's in a sense the brain or the mind recognize its limitations. It could only do so many things within its available CPU, you want to put it that way, in order to, in a sense, so you have to slough off the unimportant space so that you could have, because you got a limited library, so you could only store the information that's necessary. And that's part of nurture and the development culture itself. And so we are dependent on that because we have an overcapacity. We have desires that is overcapacity to what we could handle. And if we didn't have that, then in a sense, I suppose we have a size of a brain of a football field. And that'd be very, very hard to maneuver around, like, yeah, that would enrich our creativity. But on the other hand, the complexity just would be enormous because, like be geometric. So that itself it's interesting because it means that for whatever reason, living substances have a way of regulating itself towards limitations rather than ever expanding possibilities. And we are somewhat contradicting that now in terms of developing artificial intelligence. Not that it's intelligent, but in other words, there's a lot more storage capacity. There's a lot more books than any of us could ever handle. And so therefore, we have to be selective. And maybe that's also the reason why culture has developed into specialization, because we can't handle the truth, as we point out. So therefore we have to limit it and allow ourselves to be blind in certain areas and only ask for advice for somebody who is an expert in that certain area. And so it almost seems to almost also necessitate a relationship with a community, because none of us singularity, no matter how smart we are, could handle all that information. That's just my thought, because we are in some sense overdeveloped. We have to prune back in order to create, the garden of beauty and understanding. All right, that's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. There's two places we certainly see that, and one of them is we know during embryogenesis there is a stage in the development of the embryonic brain where neural apoptosis takes place, and there's a huge die-off of neurons. It's basically a big pruning that takes place, because if the brain is fully connected, you can't think clearly. Everything's connected to everything else, and there's a certain amount that has to be pruned back to make it possible to reason. It would be fast. I wonder, you know what I don't know? I don't know whether that same neuronal apoptosis phase happens in other animals. Is that distinctive to us, or is that something that happens in all animals? I don't know. But you also see what you're talking about in a non-physical, but in a sort of lifestyle way with the, what do they call it? The drama of the gifted child, right? The kid who seems to be at first good at everything, and because they're good at everything, they try to learn everything. And a certain number of them figure out that it's not going to be possible, and they learn to specialize in something. And sure, they may spend the rest of their life still reading about everything, but there's some particular area that they're going to dive into and become good at. But there's plenty of smart kids that grow up to never specialize in anything and to not actually succeed at all as adults, because they read everything that they can read. They stay up late. They can't discipline themselves to go to bed. They have trouble going to work the next morning because they're sleep deprived. And at work, they don't finish things. They keep putting things down and picking up new things, and you sort of end up with decades later, and I speak from experience, decades later, you leave behind you, this enormous track record of unfinished started projects on a variety of subjects. It's kind of what you're talking about, is the inability to focus, the inability to prune away, what's not on the core path, and dedicate yourself to something,
Well,
and can lead to a failure to finish things.
well, this seems to be a very, very strong argument that, for the so-called supreme individualists, there's no such thing. We all depend on each other, at least to a certain degree.
Right.
So therefore, maybe that's part of the reason why developing a community, ever since Homo erectus, we developed the community, because the diversity allows you to supply certain diverse information that each individual does not have. So we are, the relationship between us and the community cannot be just chopped off. Like some people will, I don't even call them rugged individualists, at least, but just sort of like, I guess isolated individualists. That doesn't work.
Yeah.
So,
anyway, they're interesting points. Thanks, Phil. Sharon, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Well, when we were discussing this last week, I had an interesting take on what it takes to be a self-provident individual. I don't know what that is. And you brought up the point about what words really mean. And one of the things I like to read some of the Supreme Court decisions, particularly for the guys who are textualists, right? Textualist versus originalist. That's always interesting because it's always a play on words. But my issue with this is I do not think, and I'm not sure if culture and reason can allow you to lead a self-provident life. And a self-provident life means that where you develop to the highest point, or you develop yourself, your mental resources, to the maximum point of efficiency and effectiveness. And I don't know if culture and reason are the only two things that do that. And that's what I have to say. So therefore, that takes me back to the point where I don't know what those two words mean.
Yeah. Yeah, the more I read Kenneth Smith, and the more I struggle with issues of culture and reason, the less sure I am that I know what they mean either. I mean, I don't think any of us have really. Well, let me give you an example, Sharon. Your father cultured you and your siblings towards, really having initiative in your life and to really trying to better yourselves. And that's an advantage that you had starting out in life. There's plenty of people who are cultured the other way around. They're told to shut up and sit down and not cause trouble, and to just try to get by. And if you imagine the character arcs of you and your siblings versus people who've been told to not make waves and not try to climb, you can imagine there's going to be a lot more failure for the people who've been taught to give up from the get-go. So these are kind of examples of ways in which the character someone's born with is shaped in part through the culturing process as they grow up.
Correct. Well, by the environmental, parental, mentoring,
Yes,
and I don't know if that's culture.
it is. It
Oh,
is.
you wanna call that culture and reason too. Because I think of life sometimes like a jungle, because if you look in the jungle, there's the lion and then there's the ant, and they have different functions, but
Right.
they survive very differently
Yes.
and they face different life risks.
Yes.
So that's life. So the best thing is to learn to play the hand you're dealt.
Yeah. To learn how to play it.
Yes.
Yeah. And to not pretend that that's not the hand you were dealt. It's like the people who are dealt a certain hand in life and then they try to pretend that that's not their hand, they tend not to succeed. They're
Yes.
acting in life as though their circumstances are wildly different than they actually are, and as a result, they're not prepared to deal with the real challenges that they face. Um, you know, I've got Finnish ancestors among others. I'm a mutt, and I've got a Finnish great grandmother, and I've done some reading about Finnish culture and Finnish history. And there's the indigenous Sami people who were probably there before the Finns. There's some debate about how long ago the Sami were there, but the Finns tend to be along the coasts more than they are inland. And the Sami are a mix. Sami, people will have heard of the Sami because they're the reindeer people, the ones who herd reindeer.
For the reindeer,
Yeah. But it turns out that's just a popular image of the Sami. There's actually at least two and maybe three different cultures among the Sami. The inland cultures herd reindeer, all right, but there's also a coastal Sami culture, and they're all fishermen, and most of them don't raise reindeer and wouldn't know how to. Their culture is completely different. It's the life that you have to live if you're going to be a fishing people in the far north is spectacularly different than the life you have to live if you're going to be an inland people that are living with the reindeer herds and cultivating those reindeer and cultivating yourself to be able to live in harmony with them. And I think it's they speak the same language more or less. They have a lot of the same religious practices, or they used to before they got colonized. There's a lot of things that they have in common, and yet they've diverged because the hand that's dealt to you on the coast of Finland is different from the hand that's dealt to you in the upper mountain valleys of Finland. It's a different way of life, and that way of life demands a different culture. If you're going to be a self-provident people, you have to attend to the actual circumstances that you're living.
So self-providence has a range, different level of effectiveness. It's like the different cultures all around the world.
Yeah.
Different cultures, different reasoning. If in some countries of the world, if you steal, it's okay to chop your hand off.
Yeah.
If you do that here, it's a problem.
Yeah. And even outside of human culture, the cheetah and the gazelle have different cultures. The cheetah culture is more uniform across the world. Cheetahs tend to be like each other, and the gazelle culture is more uniform across the world. But no one would confuse gazelle culture for cheetah culture. Their goals are opposite, among other things, which is I would like to catch and kill that gazelle versus I would like to not be caught and killed by that cheetah. Their focus and their attention is very different, and what self-providence means to each one is related, but absolutely antagonistic, in that sense.
So within self-providence, you have diversity.
Yeah.
And
it's necessary. And this goes back to Hegel, when Hegel's talking about to abstract is to be an error. To really understand your situation, you have to know not just vague generalities and idealizations about your circumstances. You have to know the concrete stuff. Exactly. Think about the way indigenous cultures know their plants. This plant is edible. That plant is medicinal. That plant is poisonous, and they know them all specifically. And you go to the average person in Seattle and you point to some random plant growing up through the crack and you say, "What's that?" And you're going to get something like a flower, a weed. I don't know. We are really disconnected from our circumstances. And as a result, if you dumped an average Seattleite out in the wilderness and said, "Okay, make a go of it," we'd fail because we don't have the skill sets required to know what any of these things are. We have abstract generalities in our head about the land that we're living on. But the Salish people 150 years ago on this exact same spot, they walked around with an encyclopedia in their heads, about all the plants and what they could be used for, which ones could cure burns, which ones you could make a shampoo from, and that sort of thing. Because they had to know those things. That's what self-provident meant to them. So, these issues of self-providence, these are deeply complex. This isn't a simple, it's like you're saying, this is not a simple thing. It's very diverse. But it's not randomly diverse. It's diverse in the question of how well are we harmonizing our thinking and behavior to the actual forces that are pressing upon us in our life. If we harmonize well, then we're self-provident. But if we harmonize poorly and we don't attend to the things that matter the most, then we're self-destructive. And
No, it just depends on where you are in the process.
yeah, yeah. And it's why we don't want to let a little kid and a hot stove be alone together in the kitchen. There's a certain stage after which it's safe to do that. But before that stage, they're not going to be self-provident about this thing because they don't know what it is. They don't know why you don't touch it. So anyway, these are the the undercurrents running throughout this. Thanks, Sharon. Donald, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Well, you have chosen wisely. I think you have a self-provident life, but our life at the biological level provides some basis for developing self-providence. I think we've all suffered a good hangover that's taught us something. Maybe a good beating, maybe mistreatment, or other experiences. That sort of gnostic experience of the world provides some. I agree with Kenneth, and his point is it's not strong enough in human beings to guide their life, to let them choose wisely. I mean, you almost see this in like dogs will overeat. Cats almost never overeat. Not every even animal by nature guides itself perfectly. I mean, and we guide ourselves for the first 9 months really well. I mean, we've had that quote before. So, but I think we build on that, that experience. We come to ideas about justice primarily, I think, from being treated unjustly by people, or in fact, I'd say that about a lot of our virtues. We learn them first in their negative forms, and we experience in our own lives the harm they cause us, and extend that to others, and it helps us to choose. Now, that also, though, reinforces what Kenneth is saying here about it's only in the context of the group that I don't know. That's one of the things, if there was only one person, which there can never be just one person, it takes way more than that to get. I doubt if just 2 people could ever get to 3, because it would take. When would those 2 people find time to do anything? Because they'd be taking care of the 3rd one for a while. So it does take a larger, and that allows us for the kinds of cultural experiences cultural or societal. I don't know what the word is. The groupiness. Before maybe we call it sociology or culture or something like that, that allows us to begin forming from our basic experience, gnostic, almost the biological experience of dealing with other people, that they can hit pretty hard, they can run pretty fast or whatever. To begin that making the decisions that help us get us to self-providence. And you would hope that you would build on that to a culture that supported it multiple ways. I mean, modern culture is not as supportive. Is not supportive. I think that's Kenneth's point here. How do we get self-provident? Well, yeah, you learn it. Clearly, you learn be self-provident by watching sitcoms on TV or something. Okay, enough from me.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a little scary the extent to which we do our acculturation of children through television, mainly because we don't have the time to raise our own kids. It's like if it weren't for the boob tube, you sit them in front of the TV and this is our chance in the afternoon to do something. We've been working all day. This is our first moment to ourselves. And the side effect is, they're being raised by the television and not by us. I speak as a member of the television generation. Fortunately, my parents stuck me in front of Sesame Street and nature documentaries, which was helpful. But I knew a lot of people growing up that they didn't watch either of those things. They got their culturing from Leave It to Beaver or God knows what, Gilligan's Island, which is a little scary. You're not going to learn a lot about self-providence from from some of these shows. I see you coming off mute, Sharon.
Interesting story. So when I first came to America, I was 25 years old, and I went to work in the operating room. And if you've never been inside an operating room when it's running, it's a pretty hostile place. It's full of stress and hostile, and people are rude and unkind. So I couldn't understand the culture. And so I started watching Archie Bunker. And that was my learning tree of the negative side of America. And I thought about it. I learned so much there. And then I started identifying the guy who came from the Deep South, the guy who came from the North, the way he treated the patients, because we're in an inner city hospital. Most residents are trained in inner city hospitals where you meet the poorest of the poor. And you learn very quickly about the attitudes. Very, very quickly about the attitudes of a physician towards the people. And I saw some of it reflected in Archie Bunker. And I watched Archie Bunker for about a solid year just to figure it out. So, Donald, I get it. It's not a good example, but it's what I saw. And I couldn't understand George Jefferson for the longest while. Never met anybody like him.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, that was a good choice actually to watch because the All in the Family was specifically created to try to teach about those attitudes and where they come from and the effect they have on society.
As a Southerner, I was just glad that Archie was a Northerner.
Right. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, acculturation, something sort of entered my mind in recent times. And yeah, it's dead on. The greatest manifestation of culture is what goes on within a family group or a small tribe. But the thing is, of course, that the acculturations between different sorts of people can be even contradictory. They will arrive at certain values, The classic case was the attitudes to burial in the ancient legend of the Persians and the Greeks, and how powerfully the Greeks felt, oh, you have to bury the person or they'll have a nervous breakdown. But the Medes would say, no, 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 you leave them out in the open and the birds of prey come down and they pick the bones, and the Greeks are going, what's that? And all this sentiment, all this emotion is cultivated. But I think something which is so overlooked at the moment, for example, you know, there's all this stuff going on about people who feel that they're defective, but they blame something which is physical or material rather than practice. So a lot of kids are brought up badly and they think that that's in their genes. And I come to the conclusion a lot of it is just simply cultivation and practice when they're kids, because we're not always that in favour of existing, not always that in favour of life. It's, for example, say, love of your parents or your siblings, that feeling of love, which is part of the drive that makes you follow them, or, you know, do what your dad does. Oh, yeah, that's the absolute truth because I love my dad. Yeah, what he does must be right. And you become skilled at gaining what your father's doing. But of course, in the modern culture, where the parents of particularly the lower socio-economic orders have decided they're too busy to look after their children. Oh, the state can do that. The school can do that. The school will teach them everything. I just don't have the time, or I couldn't be bothered, or like my dad spend all his time down the pub. Don't worry, the school will take care of everything. Or my mother who's too busy cooking and watching TV. Don't worry, the school will do everything. And then they go around saying, oh, why aren't you empathetic? Oh, there must be something wrong in your genes. This is a sort of that sort of monism which showed up, which Karl Marx was such a particularly grand example, but he only himself learned from the masters, that everything which is a practice must have a material basis. It has to be in the matter itself. So there's no worries. You don't have to practice to become a good piano player. You must be able to just put your fingers down and become a grand master of piano playing. Oh, you know, it's like you when you do your martial arts, Rick. It's all about cultivation. It's all about practice. You don't instantly become a grand master, but where's this crazy attitude rolling around today? I think they were criticising, you know, the latest Star Wars film where Rey, unlike Luke Skywalker, is instantly good at everything. They call it the Mary Sue phenomenon. But that's just not very often actually in reality. People make mistakes. The trick is to learn from your mistakes and recover. But this is just not going on a lot today. There just seems to be a misunderstanding of cultivation and practice. But don't leave out the emotion. We want to live is an emotion, is a feeling. They seem to be thinking that automatically people are always encouraged by some drive, which is partly true, but not as absolutely true as common opinion has it. We do need emotion. We do need drives. We need perhaps what Schopenhauer was identifying as the will. There was an anti-rationalist criminal. He said, no, 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 no. It's the will, baby. Oh, and the 99 rationalists out of 100 were saying, no, no, that's nonsense. It's the rationale. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, you know, these things, you get convergence. It's one of my favorite concepts in in science. It comes out of biology and evolutionary science. And the concept of convergence is that you don't need a conspiracy. There doesn't even ever need to be a decision. You just have to have, living things subjected to the same forces. And even if they're completely unrelated living things, if they stay long enough subjected to the same forces, those species will gradually move towards each other. What they actually move towards is what is the configuration that makes it possible to thrive under these circumstances. And they do that because the ones who don't die off, and you're left with the ones that are a little bit closer and the ones who are a little bit closer. And next thing you know, you've got a dolphin and an ichthyosaur and a swordfish, and they've all got that same streamlined body, and it's because the pressure on them. So these things operate in a dysfunctional way in an anti-culture like the modern marketplace, where if people don't have time to raise their kids, then they have this problem of shame, right? Which did I screw up? Did I do a bad job raising my children? And the market is not going to miss an opportunity. It's going to say, no, it's not your fault. They were born that way. They're defective, physically defective. But fortunately, I'm here with the treatment, not a cure, mind you. But if you give us a steady revenue stream of your money, we'll supply you with these little pills, and they will keep your child from misbehaving quite as badly. And the parents and the children and the marketers are sort of cooperating unwittingly in developing this model, which is that they're just broken, and this little pill will fix them. And the idea that what we have going on is a dysculture, and these are not good circumstances for raising healthy human beings. And it doesn't matter. I mean, to some extent, it doesn't matter what your genetic component is, because we're designed to be malleable. And if you put people under malleable circumstances that are unhealthy, that are self-destructive, they're going to grow up and have troubles. That's just what's going to happen. Unless an enormous amount of energy and effort is put to counteract that, they're going to get the full brunt of it. So this is what we were talking about last week, the weird way in which Aldous Huxley writes Brave New World as a dystopia. And this is not to be desired, that you're going to try to fix the world's problems by making people satisfied with them. Just take a soma and smile. You don't have to actually change the world and make it better. We just have to make you enjoy the suffering. And if you enjoy the suffering, what's the problem? Why should I be sad? You're not objecting anymore. The fact that nobody's living up to their potential and their arete, and society's denied the gifts of a bunch of healthy human beings. Whose business is that? Nobody's business. I'm making a tidy profit this quarter. Shut up and leave me alone. So yeah, I mean, there are good reasons why people would good. There are strong reasons why people would settle on the model of, if things don't turn out well, it must be physical, it must be genetic, it must be hormone imbalances, it must be, you're just born broken. But good news, I've got the solution for you here, just $9.95 a month. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, my thought is that there's two important things that need to be tended to, that ought to be somewhat in balance. And that's the notion of identity and difference. Because on the one hand, if you live in a culture, an important thing is you got to fit in. You have to understand the culture and know what it is, and in a sense maneuver in a certain way. But you also have to have this sense of difference, because if the situation should change drastically and you only have identity, then you wouldn't know what to do, because the things you used to do always worked, and now suddenly it doesn't work. And I'm thinking of two specific instances. One was like, I forgot the name of the movie, but with Kevin Costner living with the Plains Indian, I mean the Indians, and I remember, like,
Dances with Wolves.
What? Yeah,
Dances with Wolves.
yeah, Dances with Wolves. Yeah, yeah. That was a situation in which I said the Blackfoot, they were they were being, in a sense, pushed away. And of course, there was a scene, I think, that, like, of course, it sort of involved Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull and Kevin Costner. And, they were explaining how the thing is, of course, Crazy Horse embedded in the culture that it was, that's going to fight to the death. He's the brave hero that's going to do that. And, and you honor him for doing that. But on the other hand, when Kevin Costner say, like the people will be coming, you're seeing them now, they're coming. And Sitting Bull asks, well, how many are there? He says something like, as many as there are stars. And Sitting Bull says, oh my gosh, resistance is impossible. We need to be adaptable, And despite the fact that it's just a shame that we have to like withdraw into the mountains even more, that is necessary because the conditions have changed. And that was wisdom versus his courage, right? And Sitting Bull was right. I mean, given that situation, if everyone was going to adapt what Crazy Horse was going to do, then they would be wiped out. Like die with your, I guess, die with your moccasins on, including the women and children. So that's the first thing I thought is like, yeah, you have to have that thing which you could recognize things aren't going to be the way it always was. And the problem is that so many people are lured into a situation in which this is the way it is, this is how I fit in, this is how I get the job, whatever it is, And things go pretty smoothly, and you might not be in the best of jobs, but at least you got a job and everything is fine, and you depend on the culture in a sense to provide. But things could change drastically, and you need that. The other example I want to point out, and I just maybe about a month ago, 3 weeks ago, I saw this incredible video on Euclid, particularly the fifth postulate. Euclid was a great genius. He developed the four postulates, which is about identity, how things would work in a certain system. But he threw in the fifth postulate, and people never could understand and thought, this is a mistake. Why is this postulate in there? And it took them, I think, until the 17th century when the mathematician said, the fifth postulate is really something about changing the system and creating, a kind of creativity. And there was a mathematician, and then there was later a greater mathematician who says, yeah, parallel lines do intersect, because all that mathematics was developed in a planar geometry. And if you have a spherical geometry, parallel lines intersect, as we know that they intersect at the North Pole and the South Pole. And so, and you have to be able to see a different system and see that if you can imagine that, then space itself changes the structure of the relationship, of the theorems, of the postulates. And so I don't know how he understood that the fifth postulate was a very important part of the whole thing, but that anticipated, that little clause anticipated the possibility that there's more dimensions to space than there's Euclidean geometry, which is interesting. Like if it wasn't for that sense of difference, and everybody questioning, like, well, why is this here? He made a mistake. The great Euclid made a mistake. He did make a mistake, but it just took a long time for people to suddenly, like Sitting Bull, realize, oh my God, things are different. They're different under certain spatial conditions. And I think that we have, at least in the Western culture, probably throughout, I shouldn't pinpoint it just the West, we have put too much emphasis on identity and not enough on the fact that difference is also an important part of the identity. And if you don't respect that difference, then in a sense, you're gonna become like the dinosaurs. Of course, the dinosaurs had an excuse. They never expected an asteroid to hit the Earth, right? And guess what? Thank goodness for the difference. Those little animals who were running around like mouses that held no place. They were just food for all the dinosaurs. If it wasn't for them, there wouldn't be anybody left, you know. So in some sense, something that seems like, these guys are not very efficient, they're not very good, you know, they're just like food for for the whatever. It's like suddenly now, as mammals we are the head of the world. And in some sense, we wonder whether we shouldn't be a little bit more diverse in our understanding before we fall off like the dinosaurs in some catastrophe, particularly since we made it ourselves. So I always appreciated the fact that I don't want to put too much of a spin on it, that I think at least the arts, for me at least, has allowed me that sense to, like, I always depend on fitting in a situation, but when I end up losing a job, it's just amazing. Suddenly I adapt and I end up finding another job. And it's like, but that doesn't click on until, like, oh, when push comes to shove, like, you have to adjust and just say, doing the same old is not going to work this time. It has always worked before, but it doesn't work this time. If you throw away the difference, then
Yeah.
you got a problem.
Yeah.
That's it. So.
Thanks, Phil. Donald, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
For Phil, in modern, I think Bernhard Riemann and David Hilbert are kind of famous people that curve space type mathematicians. Not that that's of anything, but 50 years ago when I studied mathematics, so that's who we studied. The Huxley and Soma, with making us happy. So many, I think that's almost a reductio ad absurdum of the sort of psychological approach to diagnosing what's wrong with culture, what's wrong with a culture, our culture, some other culture, whatever. The psychological approaches ultimately can't get to what needs to change in the culture, so they drift towards what needs to change in the person. And I think that's a weakness. We'd like to get people whose heads are on straight. I'm just thinking about Aristotle or Plato or whatever. A lot of what they were doing was, well, how do we be good people in the midst of a real shit show here with, those Macedonian barbarians have taken over. They don't have any culture. They wouldn't know philosophy if it, tripped their horse. Who knows? And psychological approaches at the end, if they can't evolve to sociological, I don't know if that's right, maybe, like, at least Marx said he wasn't trying to change people so much, he got to change the society. I'll grant that. And one of the things I think about this is Kenneth often recommended Philip Reef, and I've read, I don't know, a lot of books by 5 or 6, and the first 3 are really good. The first 3 are just dead on, the kind of things that you look at it, but then it almost becomes, since he's looking at societal problems psychologically, he almost drifts into, well, what can we do to make people more accepting of this or happier with it or whatever, which is not where I think we want to go. So I'm just saying that Huxley, the Soma, is sort of the end result. And Stephen can click and talk to us about Jordan Peterson here in a bit, but
You've read my mind. I've noticed your psychic powers now. You talked about overeating, and your wife appears with the sandwiches.
Yeah, well,
magnificent. You've been taking pills to do this, have you? You've been
no,
to a doctor, taken pills,
no,
and
it's
developed mental abilities beyond normal.
It's lunchtime here in Arizona. That's all that my wife has to do. Is I can't fix lunch because I'm talking here, but lunchtime comes and goes anyway. All right. Well, I just wanted to say, Soma, reductio ad absurdum, the end result of psychological efforts to create happy societies. You know, and there are they're philosophical, military. There are all kinds of ways to create other societies, but psychological analysis can end up often in the Soma types.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of more people have read 1984 than have read Brave New World. But clearly some people have read Brave New World because they're busy trying to make it happen. I was struck by when I first saw Blade Runner, and let me tell you, I lucked out. I saw Blade Runner on its first run at the Cinerama downtown in Seattle, the big curved screen, and we were sitting up in the front row, completely immersed in it. That was the way to see Blade Runner for the first time. But let me tell you, when the scenes of the advertisement, the animated advertisement, the size of an entire building of a and all it shows over and over is a Japanese woman looking unhappy, putting a pill in her mouth and smiling, and then it cuts, and then it's from another angle, Japanese woman put a pill in her mouth, and then she's smiling. Over and over, that's all that's happening in this ad. And I thought to myself, man, the creators of this film absolutely are referencing Brave New World, but I wonder how many people in the audience understand that they're saying this, that the world is a dystopia now, and that's in part of the subtext in it that, again, I think people probably miss is that there in Brave New World, Soma didn't work on everybody. There were people who were too big of misfits for Soma to work on, and those people were exiled to the island. And that is to say, we just jettison the misfits from society, and then they stop causing trouble. And on the island, they can go live however they want, and at least they leave society alone. And he actually wrote a sequel to Brave New World called The Island, in which he talks about life in the place where all the misfits are sent to. But in Blade Runner, of course, they've inverted it. In Blade Runner, the off-world colonies are where people who have enough money, if they don't go into their little enclaves here on Earth, they go to the off-world colonies and try to have all the replicants serving as slave labor to meet their needs. And the people stuck on Earth are the misfits who don't have any money, and they can't make ends meet, and so their only way through life is to pop pills that make them happy all day long. While they endure the endlessly rainy conditions in which the sun never comes out because we screwed up the atmosphere too badly. Yeah. You know, my first exposure to Reef was his later stuff, and I had exactly the reaction you're talking about, Donald. I first read it and I'm like, what? This is nothing. But then Kenneth Smith kept pointing me back at him, so I started reading the early stuff, and it's like, oh, okay, here it is. This is why Kenneth is suggesting we read Philip Reef. It's pretty cool stuff. Joe, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I mean, I found this is pretty interesting on a number of levels because, and just starting out the idea of cultures and how they relate to their environments, and the importance of that. You know, I think that if you think about it in, you know, how that manifests itself in reality is that what's the opposite? You know, it's kind of if we're starting to say this culture is right and this culture is wrong, then what is right and wrong is based on probably materialistic purposes. And, you know, basically that's where a level of exploitation kind of comes in. It does come in. So, you know, this is mostly based on this idea of materialism. You know, not to say that, you know, being able to create forms and material goods that can you know be beneficial to everyone isn't important, but it isn't to say that that materialism is the prime reason as to why you know is the what we ought to be the goal, so to speak. And I very much appreciate that the fact that if the Euclidean example that Phil had brought up was, I thought, very important, is because by understanding different cultures, understanding different language and how language captures different concepts is helps us actually challenge conventional wisdom. And, you know, when you're able to challenge that, then you are able to come up with another approach towards mathematics that gave us a lot of important things that we use today, even things like GPS, and even the way virtual reality works itself. I don't know how good that is, but nonetheless, it gives us a. So what it really does tell us on a more fundamental level is the value of pluralistic systems, you know, that with both, you know, Euclidean and non-Euclidean geometry, that they can coexist. And so that is, I think, important, because then coming back to this idea of materialism is not necessarily the prime thing anymore. It's not the idea of truth itself. Right, it is fundamentally different, right? So we don't feel like we have the truth because we have two different systems, and then therefore we don't feel like we should impose truth on someone else. And I think that that's really the important thing to understand, is that there is to appreciate the differences and you know, kind of and to integrate, not dominate. So I'm not saying that, you know, creating material goods is all bad. I'm just saying when it's the prime thing that's problematic. And so anyway, a little bit all over the place there, but it was a lot of interesting points that were being made. And I think the language aspect of it, even the loss of languages, is actually going to be something that is not, you know, if they do become extinct, would be really unfortunate because of what concepts are able to be captured in a different way.
Right.
And how that can be integrated into understanding reality even more, I don't know, even in an even more fruitful way. Anyway.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, this is rich stuff. I'm going to push the text along a little bit and then I'll call on Phil. So to wrap up paragraph 7, the final sentence of paragraph 7 is saying this issue of self-providence. And I've read this so many times, and it wasn't until a month ago that I made the connection between this final sentence of paragraph 7 and the issue of self-providence. That there's so many things going on in here, it's easy to lose the thread. But the thread is self-providence, that we don't naturally, instinctively know what's good for us, although we tell ourselves we do, and that we have to be cultured effectively into paying attention to self-providence. And that's a problem that we have as a species that's distinctive of our species. It's every bit as distinctive as our creativity and our intelligence. In fact, and for the same reason, it's exactly the same cause that produces both results in us in evolutionary terms. And so the result is we have to have this extended childhood in which we're cultured. And this is where if you Google stuff on Homo sapiens evolution and stages of development, there's really interesting work going on in the last 30 years that talks about, and I've mentioned this before, that talks about the evolution of new stages of development in childhood and adolescence in Homo sapiens. You know, like the 6-month adolescence of a gorilla or a chimpanzee is extended into like 10 years of adolescence in Homo sapiens. Now, why did that happen? And similarly, the baby teeth stage. Why do we develop baby teeth? And all of this stuff gets into, increasing, on the one hand, the reproductive capacity of Homo sapiens mothers by being able to offload some of the child rearing onto the community and onto older siblings, and why grandparents live longer, why there's stages at the end of life that drag out life, again, so that you can have this acculturation process. The acculturation, you can see our dependency on it in the evolution of these stages of development that other species, even very closely related ones, don't have, or have to a much lesser extent. It's just fascinating work that's going on right now. And most people aren't even aware that this evolutionary research is happening. Most of us are stuck back in the 19th century going, hey, look, we developed hands, we developed language. Yes, that's nice, but we also developed childhood, and we developed adolescence and these other things. And the reason for all of these things in the extended lifespan is that we're so dependent on culture that anything you can do to improve the process of acculturation improves the survival rate for the species. Our ability to thrive is directly related. So the Greeks, we're talking about here, just Kenneth is saying that all of these issues of learning to be self-provident, they lump together under what they call paideia. And I've been using the term paideia for over 20 years, but I've been using it not in this sense. I completely missed this element of it, that it's about learning to be self-provident. And this goes hand in hand with a theme that Donald will recognize, that Kenneth often mentions the issue that the Greeks almost never tell you when someone is born. They could care less. They rarely tell you when someone dies, but they almost never tell you when they're born. They tell you when they flourished. When were they at the peak of their powers? That's the dates that the Greeks are interested in. That's what they put in their biographies. A lot of these people, if you go to Wikipedia and you look at a lot of famous Greeks that you've heard of, most of them have no birth or death dates. If they have one, it'll only be the death date, but they almost never have a birth date. There might be some guessing, some circa, but nobody really knows, because the Greeks didn't care. They didn't record it, because to the Greeks, you are not who you are until you have finished baking. And paideia and childhood are the process of finishing baking and becoming a person. This is critical as far as understanding the difference between the modern perspective and the ancient perspective. We're obsessed with children and birth dates, and frankly, we're obsessed with embryos. But the ancients could care less about that. They're interested in, when are you at the peak of your powers? That's when you are who you are. And in the same token, this goes hand in hand with why they didn't let slaves or Banausoi vote. Because you're not, if you get stuck at the earlier stages of cognitive development and you don't go any further, then you never developed a mature adult human mind. The Greek concept is that the eristic mind is the mature adult human mind. And the others are earlier stages of development that are important. I mean, they're necessary, but that they have severe problems understanding themselves in the world. You know, distinctively severe problems among Douloi, distinctively severe but very different problems among Banausoi. And in the same way that, you know, in the modern world we don't let children vote, they wouldn't let people who didn't develop the adult human mind vote because they were not flourishing. Floruit was the Latin term that gets put into all these ancient biographies when they translate them. That to get to the point of flourishing, you have to actually finish maturing cognitively, which they're saying a lot of people don't. So this issue of paideia matters for children, with a difference between a potential human being and an actual human being, and teaching people to be concerned, you know, when they're little, teaching them to be concerned about that difference and to pay attention to it and to long to throw themselves into the challenge to push that boulder up the hill to learn how to develop, you know, the actual mature human mind, that this is the process of acculturation that people are supposed to go through from the Greek perspective. Our perspective is the opposite, right? We're all equal. There aren't people who get stuck at earlier stages, or if there are, it's because there's no later stage, and we'll guarantee that there isn't, because we're going to abort any attempt that people make to develop the mature adult human mind, and everybody's going to stay stuck at one of these two earlier stages of development where they're easier to manipulate, and society runs in a more orderly course because you don't have these troublemakers out there asking questions about, I wonder if we should, you know, fundamentally change society from the way that we're doing things. So you know, he's drawing this stuff out because this is one of the major points of difference between the ancient worldview and the modern worldview, is what are the stages of development and how easy is it or difficult is it for people to learn to be self-provident. I mentioned it last week. I'll probably mention it every week for a while, because it's the theme for the rest of chapter G, is this question: when you look at the modern world, how much of it is designed to teach people to look after their best interests versus how much of it is designed to teach people not to look after their best interests, to make them the perfect attendees of a carnival, right? You want to teach people that there's no such thing as a conspiracy, the game isn't rigged, all they have to do is try harder, spend more money, you know, just keep trying, don't question how it's all set up, just keep putting an effort into things, and surely goodness and virtue will follow. And no matter how much a game is rigged, we're not allowed to talk about that. That's you know, that's not okay. And in order to make sure you don't talk about that, we're going to teach you to read, we're going to teach you to write, we're going to teach you arithmetic, but we're never going to teach you how to watch out for con men and not to get screwed. You know, it's like, so yes. And yeah, Donald, that's an important point that you've put there in the chat. This goes hand in hand with it. So I'm just going to make sure for anyone who isn't checking the chat that this gets into the discussion. Donald writes, remember the stages of oikos, agora, and polis, right? The oikos is the household. That's where everybody begins in the household with the household people. But only some people graduate out of the oikos to the agora, to the marketplace. And the marketplace is not only the marketplace, it's not only about trade, it's also about the development of craftsmanship and skills, rising within an apprenticeship system, learning to, you know, become part of a hierarchy of growth and expertise. And likewise, only some people make it out of the agora and into the poleis, you know, where you actually, you know, have developed the capacity to think about people other than yourself, the capacity to think about not just what do I like, or what does my ideology or my training tell me, but what's actually, according to nature, the best thing to do here, you know, to be able to make decisions. It's this winnowing filtration process to try to make sure that con men aren't running the country. Of course, they don't always succeed, and they write extensively about their failures on this, but that's the intent of this class system, supposedly, that the Greeks are putting in place. It's all tied into these concepts. This is the framework that they're using to rationalize their class system, is this idea that there are these stages of development, that Homo sapiens is unfinished and needs to finish baking, and so forth. So Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I'm going to transition into a question I've been wanting to ask you and Donald. But I'm going to first talk about this aging process, because one of the things when I taught is that quite often I tell my students that, just put a check mark on the age 35. Because when you're 35, the society is not going to be as forgiving, because it's not going to only consider your potentiality and possibility. They want to know what you've done. If you haven't done anything that's of credit, then that's going to be a black mark on your progress. So you have until now, until the age of 35, to get something done that you actually have credit for. Not that, oh, we see this child, he has a lot of potential. So that's okay. But the question I want to ask is that it's kind of important to me, because it kind of addressed this whole thing about the Greeks, because I've been attending a meetup thing on Plato's Republic. And I also been attending on occasions a meetup on Plato's Laws. I've also been attending a meeting called The Philosophy of Law. So in that context, in the Plato's Republic, I was asking to me a very important question that was sort of somewhat ignored. I first asked, like, was Socrates, who's the protagonist, speaking for himself or speaking as a mouthpiece for Plato? Because that's an important question. And the question I asked is that Socrates was proclaimed by the oracle that he was the wisest man, I don't know if Athens or Greece or the world, but he was the wisest man. And Socrates was puzzled by that, and he realized he didn't know that much. And how is it that he's the wisest? And he finally came to the conclusion he was the wisest because he at least knew that he doesn't know. And everybody was pretending that they actually did know. Okay. So maybe that's a wisdom of saying that, you're still in a development stage of exploring. And I don't know whether Plato is saying, oh, no, 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 no. You're being a joker. You actually do know. So I asked the question, like, if Socrates was honest and not playing the comedy act, oh, just poor dumb me, like Sharon sometimes like to play, then, and it's true, then how is it that somebody who doesn't know anything going to be head up the whole thing about developing the proper structure for the city when he doesn't know? Okay. Now, the credit to him is he at least didn't just like write a theory and that's it. He talked to other people, okay? But they're all kind of idiots, as he shows, okay? So that wasn't any help, but maybe it does help him to say, well, it certainly isn't that. And I said, if he's ignorant and he's trying to build the proper city, the proper society, and he doesn't know, how is that different from Oedipus? Maybe the difference is that Oedipus didn't know he didn't know, and he was rather arrogant about it, And, although the soothsayer said, be careful, what you're doing, but he was a blind man. You're going to listen to a blind man tell you what you see. So he ended up destroying, thieves because he was blind. But didn't Socrates just tell everybody that he was blind? And yet he's trying to build a city in the proper way? how's that possible? And of course, I was actually surprised because that seemed to me a very important question. Of course, they haven't gotten there yet. And I think some people are trying to say, well, that's sort of Socrates building up the stage. But I'll wait till you come to when Plato talk about the analogy of the cave. That'll clear it up because Plato actually climbs out of the cave and he sees the daylight, right? And before it was shadows. Of course, your Socrates is still talking in the shadows. And at that point, you're going to understand what the divided line is in that sense. Okay, maybe that's so. Then I thought, okay, then I popped to like Hegel. I said, Hegel's actually sort of almost implied, because I don't know if Hegel said that, but that seemed to be implied that Plato was wrong. Nobody was wise enough. Even though I thought, well, maybe wisdom is not actually knowing something. Wisdom is like knowing your limitation and doing the best you could. But he doesn't know. And as like Hegel says, it's going to be a very slow process, long process, and it's history that will reveal what it is. Because nobody knows and everybody's stupid. We're bumping into each other. Finally, we slowly, like bumper cars, we finally, we're finally getting a little bit, But even Hegel sort of implied that at the end, philosophy would rule the world because it will at some point, I guess, actually know. Okay. And then, of course, that throws everybody off it. Who's it? Francis Fukuyama said, well, 1989, which, by the way, was before the fall of the Soviet Union. He says, oh, this is the end of history because we're at the end of development. So I just want to ask you, Donald and you, Rick. I actually told the story to in the philosophy of law class meetup, and they were more responsive to it. I guess they weren't stuck with well, just wait till the divided line, then they'll clear it up. Could you explain to me where I'm wrong asking that question, Donald or Rick? Because you're trying to build the Greek city, the ideal city, and yet you're totally ignorant. How do you build a good city when you don't know what the hell you're doing, except that you're doing the best you can? It doesn't say we're doing the best we can, like, it'll develop as it goes. And maybe that's why the philosopher king, it's just always making judgments, which is not really, not really how should I say truth and not a true knowledge, but it's just sort of making judgment as best you can. Isn't that what we're doing each way? We don't know quite sure what's going on. We're just making a judgment like this is what we need to do because we're living in a world that's got that ontological difference, and we're called to make a decision when we don't have it, but we have to do something. We could just sort of sit there like, well, let's since we don't know what the hell's going on, let's not do anything. That's not what existence is about. You got to do something in spite of the fact that you actually don't know what the hell you're doing. So is that the problem? Could you explain that to me? Because I would like to know how this is solved. That a blind man should be able to build the proper city. Okay. I have to answer the door. So, sorry.
Well, of course, I'm gonna bat that one to Donald to start with because part of the question there's two different questions here. One of the questions is what does Kenneth Smith think? But another deeper question, an older question is what do Socrates and Plato think about Phil's question? How is the blind man supposed to help design the perfect city, the perfect republic? I see you thinking, Donald.
Well, I think I should at least let Phil hear the answer. If if they're,
Yeah.
one, I think on Kenneth Smith's and on Socrates' terms, history is open-ended. It's not over. But I also don't think that Socrates doesn't know anything. That's he's not the blind man. He is a stonemason. He has a skill. He works. Some ancient sources say he's got statues on the Parthenon. Fine. Or someplace, someplace else. The other is, of course, that comes at the end of his life. Read the Apology. Socrates, I don't know if in the Apology does he I think he does there tell again that story of, the guy that went to Delphi to find out who was the wisest man, and they said, it's Socrates, and then Socrates tried to figure out why he was the wisest man. But Socrates clearly there says certain things. There are things that are unsure. We're unsure about. The arguments aren't conclusive. He said, but then he says very clearly, he says, but no one will ever convince me that it's better to do evil than to suffer evil. There are certain things, certain statements through all these arguments and the dialogues and whatever, that at the end of his life, Socrates says, there are certain things that I've just never encountered a counter argument that made any progress against these positions. And so maybe in the next life or somebody hundreds of years down will come up with something. So I know there's a whole school of this thought, Phil, that's largely based on, I think, Kierkegaard, Socrates, and the concept of irony. That Socrates was a funny guy. He's not really a philosopher. He's really a comedian, that's pulling this scam. So I tend to think, now, Socrates does have some things. I mean, he clearly doesn't believe that doing philosophy is sort of memorizing these verbalizations. That there's some orthodoxy or catechism, probably a better word, that one can remember and therefore get things. In fact, my memory fails me partially here, because there are dialogues in which, in the earlier dialogue, Socrates takes a line of questioning with his, I don't know what you'd call, not adversary necessary, and then in a later dialogue, somebody comes back and tries to replay Socrates' own argument back at Socrates. And Socrates, because they only know the words, they don't know the reality. Socrates messes them up too, and not really debate, but in the conversation shows that they don't know. So I think Socrates would want people, and that's why maybe philosophy is not very teachable, is that people have to be able to see for themselves the underlying structures of human nature and how men behave and how the world works. And if they know these things and somebody just starts throwing words at them, they know exactly how to steer the argument to point to, oh yes, that leads to contradiction number 113. I've been through that one before. I'll just lead them right to it and then dismiss it. You know, and certainly part of what Socrates knows, he probably learned it from, may have learned it from the sophist, is all the places that go nowhere, all the arguments that lead nowhere. You know, it's like when you talk to a good Jesuit, you know, and you say something about the nature of God or Jesus or whatever, and they've like, In 1307, we went down that path, and that leads to this heresy. That Socrates, I think, has a catalog of those. He knows the arguments that go nowhere, that lead to just silly, contradictory results. And so to lead a self-provident life is to choose wisely. And part of choosing wisely is not choosing stupidly. You know, I mean, even if you don't know, and you don't know the future, and you are mortal, you know, any choosing is going to be imperfect. But if you can avoid, you know, gosh, we saw what happened the last time Joe did this, or not Joseph here in our group, but John Doe, so, you know, did that. We went down that path. There is something kind of, as Kenneth says here, you know, you need the history. You need to know the history. You need to know the details and stuff like that. And of course, Phil, at the end of reading The Republic, I am not sure that the conditions set out in the Republic for a perfect state can be met, and that it's not a reductio ad absurdum. That, you know, because what does he say? Well, like all your rulers, they can't know their children. You know, they don't select their spouses. They have no possessions. You know, there's all kinds of stuff. You have to convince a large number of people, not like Soma, but the technical people in the society, and by that I mean people that make pots and carpenters and stuff, the workers, you know, and the merchants. There's still merchants in the Republic. So you've got the Bonosoi, you probably don't have slaves in the city of the Republic, but you clearly have people that can't lead themselves, can't manage their own lives. And you've got to make them understand that. I mean, there's more books been written about the noble lie of the Republic, of the free metals and the people and stuff like that. So in order to have that city, you not only have to have this blind hidden game to get the guardians and have them be true guardians and not have them be self-dealing with their, you know, not have it become a family hierarchy, but you've got to make, you know, 90% of the people, or 80%, or I don't know how I think you could probably figure out the percentages in the Republic, but I don't know, be happy with it. without giving them soma. You know, hey, you know, I mean, I've often argued this point at work where they'd say, do you want to become manager of this team? And it would be, who else is going to be there? Well, they'd name somebody, and I'd say, he's a good guy. He manages really well. I don't mind being managed well, and that's a lot less work than to be managed well. In fact, that's how my career got started. I refused a promotion, and my boss's boss put the worst guy I could ever imagine as my direct supervisor. And in 6 months, I went back and I said, Mike, I can't take working for this guy any longer. And he says, I've been waiting for you. Job's yours. You start tomorrow. You know, so for me, it's always been, if I can be managed well, that's fine. I'm not sure that in a city, you're going to say to all the merchants and all the tradesmen, well, you should be happy. You're going to be managed well. And they're going to say, boy, you're restricting the vote. You're anti-democratic. You're just a fascist, you know. And by that, probably, I mean, like Mussolini. You're not necessarily a racist or supremacist like a Hitler, but you know. So I don't know. I think Socrates is serious. I think it's real. He's arguing in good faith. There are things he really believes. They're not all the things that we look at. We'd like to be told. I guess we'd like a bunch of we read Socrates, we get a bunch of aphorisms about how to live our lives, or what philosophy means, or how to make the weaker argument defeat the stronger, or something like that. But I don't think that's what we get. I think we get some very fundamental things about how we should behave, how we need to treat other people, how to treat ourselves and make decisions for that. Mostly these things are not very teachable because they have to be learned by people. There's a lot of arguments in Plato about, well, can philosophy be taught? You know, well, you know, I can convince you you're stupid, but you know, if you're even open to that. But I mean, you know, I thought like I was going to say about Stephen. Stephen seems to go out and look for fights with rationalists and whatever. I'm not that contentious. I'm more like, hey, I got out of the cave. Now, if I can avoid getting sucked back down in there, or I think I've gotten some perspective on my society and my own life and my own family, I'll just keep it there. I don't need to argue with other people unless they physically intrude into the way I want to live my life, you know, in which case they'll find out whether I'm willing to fight or not, you know. But the idea that Socrates knew nothing, he was in like 4 major battles in the Peloponnesian Wars. He was an outstanding soldier, tradesman, soldier, active in the political arguments and stuff of his time, best he could. You know, that he was the know nothing, whatever, I'm not buying it. But I do think occasionally he does. And in the Apology, he is very clear, you know, and that's a big thing. I say that, you know, it's like, it's better to suffer evil than to do evil, you know. That is not Greek. That is Socrates and Plato. the traditional position is do evil to your enemies, good to your friends, divide things up. And Socrates said, after looking at it, that's wrong. When I make other men better, the world becomes a better place where I get to live too. I get to live in a better place by making these other men better. And that's not Greek. That's not traditional Greek. It's those people, don't make them better, make them dead. That's what swords are for. Spears. We've got ways to deal with those people. Make them dead. It's like that old thing from old joke from Texas, where the farmer, a guy's lying dead on his land, and the sheriff comes out and he says, "What happened?" The farmer, rancher, I should say rancher in Texas, says, "Well, Sheriff, some men just need killing." And that's a very Greek perspective. Some men just need killing or conquering or enslaving. And when Socrates makes a strong argument for a state, in fact, I talked about it once before at the beginning of the Republic, he comes down. There's the thing of I think Polemachus wants to say, well, what if we force you to go down there? And Socrates is, yeah, we'll just go. No need to force. Part of the Republic is how do you get a state that's not founded on violence? So that's not Greek either. So I think Socrates is real. I don't think he saw the end of it or how to get there. I think in the end, it's not a healthy. It's not a hopeful ending in the Republic that says, "Oh yeah, all we got to do now is, convince almost everybody that it'd be better ruled by these people, and then the people we're going to use to rule them can't know their children, can't have a spouse, have no possessions, have to go to school for 40 years before they even get to practice," kinds of like that. It just piles up until I say, I don't know. It makes Marx look like a realist. That he had a concrete plan. I mean, he at least was, he knew who to kill. And Socrates, or he was willing, or his followers were, whereas Socrates was, oh, I should make these men better. I don't know. I will say one thing, Phil, and don't be. I attended last year a lot of the sessions with that group that's currently doing the laws online. They were doing, I forget what dialogues we took up, but go to a Catholic church. As far as I was concerned, they were using Plato to teach Catholicism. They had little concern for the historical background, the details of the dialogues, a lot of things like that. They were plucking out what they thought were syllogisms or syllogizing the dialogue and then saying, "Oh yeah, this is great." So if it's good for you, it's good for you. For me, it was exactly what I was taught to run away from when you read Plato. That's probably too much meandering, Phil, enough.
Well,
But
thank you, Donald. You clear up a number of things. I appreciate that. It almost seems like philosophy maybe shouldn't be called philosophy. It's almost like anti-sophistry. In other words, negating sophistry. In other words, in our court system, in a way, we're almost caught in that thing about people presenting like supposedly beautiful arguments, and you have to make a judgment like, no, that's not it. You know, like, yeah, but in a funny sense, we haven't gotten very far. We're still at the same place of negating those supposedly sharp and acute judgments and just say, no, forget it. That's not going to go anywhere. So thank you for that. That's very helpful.
Yeah, thanks to Donald and thanks to Phil too. That was a great question. I think that is the longest we've managed to get Donald to speak uninterrupted in 2.5 years of doing this.
You know, I come here because this is not contentious, this group. I don't desire contention. And I almost never actually talk about these things. You know, philosophy, I don't know. I somehow got a weird idea that it's not about talking. I mean, there is philosophers talk, but what I'm thinking, it's not academic disputation or academic philosophy ought not to be called philosophy. You know, it's just one-upsmanship or something like that. And I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't talk. I do have views on these, but on Plato, Socrates, the dialogues. But I just no, you know, nobody ever asked. Phil, thank you. You're the first one that ever asked what I think about some of these things.
So yeah, thanks to you both. And I'm really not going to add anything other than
Thanks
to
again.
underscore.
Thanks again.
I'm going to underscore the point Donald made about how you can study nothing and become an expert at nothing, and as a consequence, you make a better class of mistakes. You know, it's what he was alluding to with the, you know, Socrates knew a lot of different lines of thought that don't lead anywhere promising. And knowing that means that those are blind alleys you can skip. You don't have to find out the hard way. You've already been down there. And this is what I see in, you know, master martial artists. They have made all the what makes them a master is they've made enormous numbers of mistakes and they know not to go there. You know, whereas a beginner, those mistakes are the things that look the most attractive. They're reasonable. They make sense. They feel right when you start out. They might be ideologically, you know, approved, and yet they're still the wrong thing to do. And the only way to find out is by blundering down the alley and discovering the terrible consequences. What you said about the Jesuits rings true on this too. That whole issue of there is a kind of expertise, kind of at what passes for mastery among human beings is a kind of expertise in which the thing that you're a specialist at is things you shouldn't do. Don't do this, don't do that, don't do the other thing. I'm going to make new mistakes. I'm going to make interesting mistakes, but I'm not going to make those mistakes because I've been there and done that. And, you know, it's my friend Jerry and I use the phrase attractive nuisance, which is a legal term. You know, like if you have an old swimming pool on your rural property that hasn't been kept up and it's a hazard, maybe there's, you know, old farm machinery down at the bottom of it. If people dive in, they injure themselves and so on, and you don't take care of it, you're legally liable because it looks like a swimming pool. It's going to lure the unwary into diving into something that they shouldn't dive into. Attractive nuisance. And it seems to me that a lot of life is about learning to identify a bewildering number of attractive nuisances in life choices, things that just feel intuitively like that must be the right way to go, and it's totally not. You know, you can either find out the hard way and you may or may not survive, or if you're lucky, you get acculturated and someone points out that there's a lion at the end of that. I know it looks like a doorway that leads to lunch, but the lunch is that's the Minotaur in there. That's a labyrinth. Don't go in there. So knowing nothing is you can spend your whole life learning about nothing. These are all different kinds of nothings that you shouldn't pursue. But it takes a lot of learning to figure out where they all are. The best in my field, I knew a couple of guys who developed a really sophisticated object-oriented approach to medical software, and we would have these debates in our programming language committee about how to add object orientation to M. And the impression I always got sitting in the back of the room was that everybody else should just shut up and listen to these guys because they'd been doing it for so much longer. Everybody else kept suggesting things that made sense ideologically or felt right intuitively, and yet they were all the wrong approaches. They were just attractive nuisances. And these guys kept trying to figure out, how can I explain to you that we already wasted 15 years trying those ideas and they're all dead ends. And the reason we succeed is we don't do those things that sound reasonable and look right and, you know, are logical. We do the what's left over by process of elimination. That's the area that those guys worked in. And that's what made them great. So I like to think of, Don, that's an interesting point. I like to think of Socrates as somebody like that. That's like, here's a whole bunch of lines of argument. You should just don't even go there. I know they look good, but it's here there be labyrinths. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I would like to know what particular vitamin pills Donald's gotten into lately. But I'm going to say Donald brought up that point of the transition with the stages of oikos. And inevitably, we're there in oikos. That's the kiddies' cliche. You're in a familiar circumstance. People know you. They forgive you for your faults some of the time. But then you go to the marketplace and you're no longer exactly in your family. Now, this is, I was thinking, I was, at the Saturday night meeting, Joe was there. And I'm watching all these guys talk, led by Leslie Allen. And one thing I pick up is there's a lot of people out there who, in the academic world, didn't make it. I'm not going to say they're failures, maybe they were, but it could be sheer bad luck. You just didn't make it. And I find amongst these wannabe academics, there are these knitting clubs. They're all crocheting and complaining about the state of academia, that it hasn't picked up on them. I'm a genius. Why didn't I make it to the top? They're all over the place. And I'm looking at some of these guys and I'm getting the impression that the trouble is they've missed out on the love word in philosophy, that you love ideas. You're not merely a sophist who is looking for ideas that can be used. And I see a lot of things that these guys are pushing a wheelbarrow. They're out there dreaming of their imaginary great society, but they're not checking their own mind and whether they understand things well. And so I was thinking these guys, and suddenly I had a flash of the old fairy tale. We're in the oikos, we're failed academics, we're all like little kids whinging about anything. If only the world was different. And I'm wondering how these guys would go if you told them, we're a bit poor now, take the family cow to the agora and get some money for it. They go there. I bet 99 out of 100 will go to the agora. Guy will show up. Here's some beans for your cow. You go, oh, that's not good enough. Beans for my cow? I said, and this is our market today. No, these are magic beans. Oh, magic beans. I never heard of these. So they trade in the cow and they come back to the oikos and say, look here, I've got magic beans. I'm telling you, this is literally the situation with a lot of people today. They've been taught as you were pointing out, taught to be taken advantage of. They're not being taught to watch out for the used car salesman. Here's this car. Oh, this isn't just any ordinary second-hand car. This one is magic. And of course, you want to be sucked in, because when we leave the oikos and go to the agora, the most tempting thing is we're looking for the easy ride. And I love the concept of an easy ride. I've loved it all my life. You think post-war America, where could things be better? And Peter Fonda and Dennis Hopper say, well, that's not easy enough. I want even an easier ride than 1960s America. That's not easy enough. So no matter how easy you'll ever make things, people will want something even easier. So how do you overcome the desire for an easy ride? Well, again, it's a love word. We have to love, as Nietzsche pointed out, the self-overcoming. When Nietzsche had his strife with academia, he must have felt bitter. He must have felt envy and resentment, and then he thought, aha, tell you what, I won't wallow in pitiful self-resentment. I'll develop a grand set of ideas that'll make me shine like a star in the universe, and all my friends back in academia look like fools that are going to be forgotten. It worked. He instead of wallowing in the, as he said, the lesser emotion, hey, I'm going to go for the grander emotion. Of course, this is an idea that Albert Ellis has stolen. Doesn't give Nietzsche the credit, of course. This is Albert Ellis's point. Oh, envy's a quality in us. Don't reject it, but you know, if the other guy comes along with the beautiful car, don't be bitter and resentful. You work on getting a car as good or even better, or maybe having some other way of dealing with things. But yeah, I wonder how, this is a challenge for you guys. You've all got the cow. You're all going to the agora. I want to see what you're going to trade the cow for. Will it be magic beans? I wonder. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm not going to worry about you philosophically anymore. If you understand the philos of philosophy,
Yeah,
that's good.
yeah, the love part, right? That's the critical thing at the bottom. And you know, I think Nietzsche talks about envy and its power among the Greeks, and that the Greeks, unlike moderns, the Greeks didn't see envy as a bad thing. They saw it as a good thing, because it eggs you on to try harder. You know, there's this concept for people who watch a lot of anime. There are different types of characters. There's different stock characters, and some of the oldest ones draw from kabuki plays and other sources. But they've developed quite a repertoire of stock characters. And people who are really into anime, they learned the Japanese terms for all these different stock characters. And they get to where the moment somebody walks on the screen, they're like, ah, that's you know, yes, they're absolutely new. We've never seen this person before. It's the beginning of the film, but you can tell by their hair and their clothes and their blah blah blah. This must be the such and such character. And they're, you know, it's in Japanese storytelling, it's a major issue. So one of the standard characters in Japanese storytelling is the rival, and it's not like in the West where the rival is the evil. It's Darth Vader's your rival and you have to destroy him. It's not that at all. The rival is the one who wants to do better than you. They want to beat you because it will make you both better to compete against each other. And it's a major theme in Japanese culture. You see it in the anime, you see it in the manga, you see it in the novels, and you even see it, you know, in Japanese dojos. If you go to not Okinawan karate, but Japanese karate dojos, there's you know, rivals are not they're not the people who, get you after school and beat you up and like the Karate Kid. Rivals are the ones who are going to try to do better than you so that they egg you on to do better than you would have done otherwise. So I'm with you, Stephen. This is not only a Japanese thing, it's a very Greek thing, and Nietzsche writes about it a lot, the way that the Greeks really embraced this use of envy to try to make people better. Yes, the philos that separates the sophist from the philosopher. I'm gonna call on Joe, and then I'm gonna take us to the text. So Joe, go ahead.
I'll keep this very brief. No, I think what, we were just talking about this, the example of Euclidean geometry versus non-Euclidean geometry. And you have two different systems and two different versions of the truth within that system, and two different perspectives. And I think that this actually is a very important point, because when relating it to what Donald was just talking about, where it's better to suffer evil than to do evil, because there is something that becomes cyclical if you do good for your friends and not, and you're mean to your enemies. That becomes cyclical. And that becomes, what that is what we're really getting to is the idea of justice and revenge, and the distinction between these two. And what happens is, the idea that what Donald was talking about actually stops that cycle, because you're not going to necessarily do evil. You'll suffer evil first. And the reason I think that this is especially important is because it's when there are two different versions of the truth, then that is really going to be problematic if you're just getting back at each other, because you're just basically both seeking your own personal satisfaction, as opposed to actually seeking something that brings closure to an unfortunate event. And this is where, there is a higher level ideal to be appealed to in that instance. And this also speaks to the importance of non-action, when to act and not to act. So it directly kind of relates to the text, because I think when we have this different systems, different perspectives, I don't think modernity just provides us a solution to understanding each other. And I think that stories, and the ability to communicate with one another, is actually kind of critical, and that our perspectives kind of it's a way of actually basically well, Socrates is a story. He's telling a story, and the story is communicating something that I think would lead to understanding, a higher level understanding, than we would if we just necessarily looked at things from a very narrow and analytical perspective, and from one particular system. So anyway, I think that this is it's an important concept, because essentially when we talk about falling back on principles, this is the reason you kind of do that. These ideas of justice, it's because you then otherwise don't fall into the cycle of revenge. Anyway, I think that it relates directly, because there's no, in some sense, there's no resolution that's going to ever be had if you don't appeal to a higher level ideal, because each individual's version of what is true will be based on the system that they're from their perspective. So therefore, better to suffer evil than to do evil is actually essential in order to ensure those systems don't actually come into conflict with one another. That was a little bit discombobulated, but I think the point was made.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting. Socrates has a number of ways in which he is un-Greek, as Donald says. The whole "I don't want to destroy my enemy, I want to make him better" is very non-Greek. Another thing that Nietzsche writes about is the ferociousness of the Greeks. It's not just envy that they embraced; they also embraced, things that we just can't make our peace with, like slaughter. That when you defeat the enemy polis, you tear it to the ground and you murder all the men and you rape all the women, and everybody gets sold into slavery. There was this, as Nietzsche says, this relishing of the slaughter that is difficult for a modern to come to grips with, to understand. And for Socrates to reject that, explicitly is from the Greek perspective very shocking. Likewise, although the final consolidation of the concept of cosmopolitan comes not from Socrates but from Diogenes. Socrates starts it. He initiates the phrase. He initiates breaking down the concept of the absolute duty of allegiance to the polis by suggesting that maybe our real polis should be the cosmos. We should transcend the interests of the polis. That's another deeply non-Greek thing. I mean, Alexander, under Aristotle's guidance, had to impose that upon the Greeks to try to create the idea of a koine Greek, a common Greek, that we could have a shared Greek identity. This did not come naturally to the Greeks either. And for Socrates to be proposing this idea that there's something larger than the polis, that your duty to the polis should come second, not first, that it should come after your duty to the cosmos. You can see how that goes hand in hand with this idea of maybe I don't destroy my enemy, I try to make him better. Maybe there's a larger picture here that we should be looking at. These are very un-Greek things, even though it's a Greek person who's saying them. And it's why, I have debates with my dad on Friday mornings. And he has accused me at times of being utopian about the Greeks and idealizing them. And I always have to remind him, dude, I am not a Philhellean. I do not want to be Greek. I don't want to raze cities to the ground and slaughter everybody. I don't want any of that stuff. I don't relish any of those things. I'm of a different era than that. But so long as we are not allowed to compare modernity to other epochs in ways in which those other epochs sometimes come off better than us in specific ways, if that's banned, if that's a sin under modernity, if any time you say, their approach to education might have been better than ours, to say that, you're accused of being utopian, then effectively all of while being a pretense of realism, the criticisms are actually, they just come down to political correctness and saying you're not allowed to ideologically challenge modernity. We have to be the best at everything. And if you ever say otherwise, you're a crazy person. You're a utopian. You're an idealist. It's part of the nuance of reading this. Kenneth is not trying to say that the Greeks were the pinnacle of history and we should all go back and be Greek. As you're going to see in medievalism, there's going to be very interesting exploration of soul and spirit and other issues that goes beyond the Greeks. And the same is true under modernity. There are things that we push ahead on. But, we have to be able to be honest about the ways in which we are not only sometimes progressing, but also sometimes regressing and forgetting lessons that our species once did better at. So I'm going to call on Phil in a second, but first, the first sentence of paragraph 8. This really just does follow directly after it's a carry on from the last sentence of paragraph 7. The things that you're teaching children, the ways in which you're trying to teach self-providence to each person, this stuff that they lump together and call paideia, and that they treat as so fundamental to becoming a person that they don't even bother to say when you were born or really to talk about you much as a child. They're not interested in that stuff. They want to know, did you come out the other side and become an adult with a mature human mind? Did you learn self-providence? So they're saying this stuff that everyone should be taught, includes the norms. Yeah, we're going to come back to formal insight in a moment. Includes the norms of the culture, includes the riches of language and literature. And we've talked about the way that they're making everybody hear the stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey. So language and literature is not just about passing the time and being entertained. It's about, can you learn about the principles and the virtues and the vices and the tragedy and inversion and so on. The subtle and acute perspectives of philosophy and politics. And of course, for us to say subtle and acute perspectives of politics, what kind of politics is he talking about? Well, he's talking about real politics, not what modernity has. We don't have a polis, so we don't have politics. We have something else we call politics, which is the subject for another discussion. But most especially the powers of formal insight, he says, that enable one to rise above the psychological morass of emotions, to see how others and oneself are thinking and what they are taking for granted. Now, this has to be pulled apart. There's a lot of things going on in here, and this is a place where Kenneth has made a little error that he makes sometimes in this chapter, and I know it's an error because in other writings and other places he doesn't make this error, and that is, it suggests that there's one way to go wrong, and that's to be emotional, and there's one way to go right, and that's to be logical, and that's not what he means at all, because he means as well as being, experientially myopic. You can be ideologically myopic, and it's equally bad. The formal insight he's talking about is more than just abstract noesis. He's talking about striving for, that Vernunft, that is the dialectic between gnosis and noesis. That's what we're talking about striving for. We're not talking about using intellectualism to overcome emotionalism. And the way that he's written it makes it easy to misread that. It's almost inevitable to misread it that way, unless you've read a lot of Kenneth. I mean, I'm confident Donald can read this and knows the full picture of what Kenneth is arguing here. But I wanted to point out that trap, and I'm glad that Stephen brought it up and then put the question marks. It's like, what is he saying here? It's like, yeah, the choice of words is a little one-sided. It's talking about the dangers of parochial emotionalism, but he also means the dangers of abstractivizing intellectualism, that's equally a danger. You have to overcome both of those things. They're both forms of psychological morass. One's a morass, the inability to separate yourself from your experiences is a morass, but likewise, the ideological traps of all the systematic thinking become a labyrinth. And they're both equally bad. You have to avoid them both. So he's saying, basically, this is another way of saying that growing out of those twin traps, going through those stages of development and moving past them into Vernunft, learning how to use gnosis to critique noesis and how to use noesis to critique gnosis, so that you string the bow of your mind and have a dialectical system that won't trap you. That is the point of childhood, is what he's saying, which is shocking. This is certainly not the modern perspective. He's saying the point of childhood is that your culture should be working with you to give you the experiences and insights that are required to develop your way through the two rudimentary stages of the human mind and rise to the level of a mature adult mind. That's the point, is to get through all of that. And once we get you out of the trap, of misreading this as merely a critique of emotionalism, the second part of it is equally important here, which is that the way that you get out of that morass and the way that you get out of the labyrinth that he doesn't refer to here but is equally important is that You learn to see how human beings think. And in the process of their thinking, you learn to see what human beings take for granted. What are the blind spots of gnosis? Granted, gnosis is better than noesis at plugging you into what's really happening. What are you really feeling? What do you really remember? What did you really experience? It has a strong reality quotient, but it has a strong parochialism as a result of that, because you're only in one part of the world and in one time at a time, if you will. So you've got this myopia. That's a major problem with gnosis. And you have to learn to see that there are blind spots, and the blind spots are everywhere when you're overly experientially focused. And then the same is true for somebody, but on the flip side of the coin, the same is true for somebody who becomes hypernoetic and intellectual. That your systems of thinking tell you what you're going to pay attention to, what's relevant to the logic of your reasoning or your law, and what's irrelevant. It's playing a foreground background game of suppressing vast swaths of reality. And as Hegel says, a lot of what's being suppressed with noesis are the concrete details that would prove that your model actually doesn't apply very well to the situation. Noesis encourages us to just abstract all those contradictory details away, and as a result, our brain becomes a bed of Procrustes, and we make things fit into our little logical schemas when actually the logical schema doesn't actually apply here. But we've taken for granted the ceteris paribus that allows us to suppress into the background the things that would have proven we're misapplying our model. It is through learning to see those systematic defects in one-sided gnosis or one-sided noesis that teaches us why we have to string the bow of our mind. It teaches us to get out of the fallacy of assuming that we have some natural intuition that ensures that we're self-provident. And likewise, it ensures that we learn to critique our formalizing, abstractivizing, intellectualizing powers to realize that although they see plenty of things wrong with gnosis, they themselves also have plenty of things wrong with them. That when we're thinking with those systems don't reveal to us their own flaws. And so they make us think that it's self-complete. We start to think intellectually that our intellectual schemas don't have the flaws that gnosis is riddled with. But of course, they're also riddled with their own noetic flaws. It's only by learning and being burned by those traps that we come to see we can't trust either one. Neither faculty of the brain, which we are rewarded for using. We love using these faculties, just like you like to taste a delicious food. You like to take a breath of air after you've been holding your breath. The same is true here. We enjoy, like the cheetah likes to run, we enjoy using gnosis. We enjoy using noesis. They feel good to us, which makes it feel like they should be self-provident for us to use. And it's only through the process of acculturation and the teaching of all these counterexamples that we come to learn that tragic inversion is a fundamental part of human life, that we lack this self-providence unless we learn to develop it sort of artificially through the process of acculturation. And that we learn what the price is for not doing it through these examples of Oedipus and everybody else. What happened to Agamemnon when he got home? What happens to all these people, all these clever, powerful people who got their way, and as a result of getting their way, everything fell to ruin? And we have to learn that in our gut to be motivated enough to resist the siren call of these two traps of our psyche. And this is what childhood is supposed to be. If childhood isn't about this, if you don't, it's like teaching kids a foreign language. It's so much easier when they're young. You try to learn a foreign language when you're 57, and it is not as easy as it would have been if you've been learning it at age 7, when your brain was plastic and malleable. You can learn astonishing things in that period of malleability. That is the perfect time to teach people about the dangers of naive gnosis and naive noesis, to teach people about the ways things can go wrong, because then they can internalize it down to the core of their being, and it sets them up to be able to rise as they grow up into the mature adult mind. But if you don't give it to them early enough, it is a long, hard struggle, assuming they can ever get out of the traps that they were in early on. And for many people, they never will. For many of us, it's too late after a certain point, which is why this has to be the stuff of childhood, not reading and writing and arithmetic. As useful as those are, and yes, we do want people to pick those things up, that's not nearly as important as do you understand? It's like handing a lightsaber to a little kid. Do you understand not to look into it and press the button? You need to learn that, young Padawan, or you're never going to make it to being a Jedi, right? The things that come naturally to us are going to be our undoing unless we learn not to push that fucking button. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
This seems like a very important concept. It's like we just discussed how it might be impossible to teach philosophy. But this almost seems to say not only it's not so much as impossible. We'll wait it too long before we teach it, right? In other words, like you got to teach it early. Of course, we essentially have evolved into essentially a technical society. We believe in the technical means of production and all that. And we have ignored all these deep things, probably especially philosophy, but now it's even the arts in a way. So no wonder we become a very mechanical society as such. You know, to me, this is a curious thing, but it really shines an insight under Heidegger in a sense. I mean, Heidegger actually tried to blend these two because I think the problem is that as human beings with limited understanding, we're plagued with essentially what's the ontological difference. And I have myself argued that instead of this being a plague, you know, like some kind of thing that is like a negative, I see it as a positive. I accept the fact that it is up to us to make up the difference between the two, to knit it together in such a way. I mean, if there wasn't that, then of course it would just it would just be easy. But unfortunately, it's just like we're caught in this relationship between being and existence, and we have to respond to both. But it's almost difficult because even with Heidegger, and I love Heidegger, but the fact is that despite the fact that he talk about these things about, you know, the feelings of experience, but he also has a very sharp intellect. So how in the hell did he fail and become a Nazi, right? Because there's another dimension that's parochial, and he seems to be not. He seems to ignore cosmopolitanism, even though he had Jews and as some of his best students. They loved him, and he kind of loved them too. And the problem there was that, you know, he saw as a kind of like a kind of a nationalist, you know, the blood and soil kind of thing. And that's where he kind of went wrong, you know, like it's just too connected to the blood and the soil. And from what's explained to me, and I'm not sure if I buy it, but I kind of do buy it, that despite the fact that some of his best students were Jews, and they pretty much loved him for it, is that he thought that they were in a way displays of frauds because they were Jews and they were not bound to the land and the soil. And so that even though many of the Jews were more German than the Germans, you know, conceptually, ideologically, they were embedded in culture. But because they were frauds, in a sense, adapting a false demeanor to their tradition, the Jewish tradition, that they will not, how should I say, imposters in a way. And to condemn a whole population because they were essentially aliens that in a sense adapted the culture, I think is the height of, in a sense, displacement, because you're forever labeling them as the barbarians because they simply exist outside, you know. But even the Greeks were better than the barbarians than them, because they'll allow you pass through, but they just don't want you to stay, you know. So, and the American Indians have that. You're allowed to traverse the land, but you just don't stay and interrupt the culture. So, I think the fact is that you have to live and figure out a way to solve the problem of this difference, because we are not defined beings, we're existential beings, but on the other hand, we're driven by something that's deeper than existence. Now, I do disagree to a certain degree from it at least personally, I kind of disagree with the fact that I agree with the part that, it's better to suffer evil than to do it yourself. I agree with that totally. But to teach your enemies about what's right, sometimes that doesn't work. And when you push too far, I myself tend to always be much more, in a way, laid back. But when it's pushed too far, I actually become a samurai. You know, I will fight back, because there are just those people who you could never educate. You know, so I'll go back to like I said, what I admire about Derrida. Even though I find it some problem that everything is structure and language, but nonetheless, this thing about deferring, it's always good to just defer something. Somebody did something wrong to you, you just let it go, defer it to a later day and see if it happens over and over again. And then that's when you get to a point that you need to fight back. Because if you don't, then those people will never actually learn anything either. So, so at some point you really have to like get into a brawl and say that, go ahead, push somebody else around, not me. But it's like, so I do find myself as like there's a certain degree of I guess you would call it macho. And I think people sort of sense that in me in a way, because they sort of think, even though I'm a pretty peaceful guy, they sort of somehow sense that there is deep down something very dangerous about me. And they pretty much leave me alone, And I think that's good to teach them to defer also, like, let's put it off. Let's not push this guy too far. So I think that you have to have that sense that you're perfectly fine with deferring, but you're not going to defer it forever. I think that's a reasonable thing to think in terms of not only weaving it together, but proportionality. Like at what point does the proportion get out of hand? That's the way I feel personally. I don't know if that's a philosophical position, but I think there are people who you can never teach them, and so you have to, get down to brass tacks, so to speak. That's it, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. Joe, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
I just think Phil brought up a very good point. I mean, the distinction sometimes that you're forced into a situation, right? So Well, one, just the idea of proportionality really quickly is essential to justice. It restores balance. I think that's justice is something where it kind of becomes an equilibrium, not necessarily you're overreacting, because then that would be revenge, as I was just saying a little bit ago, where you're merely just looking to satisfy uh, um, your uh, your desires. And so that's, and then what happens? And the other side wants to satisfy their desires. And then you're back into that cycle. So the proportion aspect of things is very important. The other part is the becoming a samurai is a very important part as well. You know, so I look at it like this, is that you know, I'm conscious of anybody that says, "Oh, you know, they would never have been a Nazi." I mean, I'm always am afraid of individuals that say that, because I think they have no sense of themselves or what's in themselves. And but so there just comes a time, though, is that when do you become the samurai? Then say, okay, well, society is forcing you to say to join this group, become a Nazi. Well, I'm not going to do that. And, you know, that is when you kind of have to fight back. So there is a moment that exists, you know, but in that moment, you have to just make sure you don't become the very thing that you loathe or are fighting against. Yeah, no, I mean, I do think that there is that moment. You're not going to tolerate, you know, certain types of injustices, but at the same time, you know, just maintain. So we live in the world, and there's a balance to be struck. That's the main point that I'm trying to make. And you know, better to suffer than to do. It just becomes, at that point is when comes what I was talking about a little bit earlier, is the need to dominate or to be right or to hold the truth. That's what I was referring to. But I think Phil made a very important distinction to what Donald said, actually, and myself as well.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. Thanks, Joe. You've got hands, and I'm gonna call on them, but I'm gonna first throw the next sentence, which we're working our way up to here. So Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I'll speak for Socrates for a little bit. The way I don't think he said it's good to suffer in injustice. No. The choice. What he did say, though, the way you treat other people is justly. And sometimes treating someone justly in accordance with their own nature is to give them a good thump. Don't confuse the limits of action with that. Somehow Socrates, I turned him into a pacifist, is what you say, that he goes around looking for injustices to suffer. I don't think so. You know, I mean, I think it was Alcibiades said he survived one battle because he was in line behind Socrates and the enemy couldn't get to it. I don't, you know, but treating other people justly can include disciplining, correcting, punishing. You know, it doesn't just, it doesn't just mean, I mean, in some cases it is, I don't know, modernity, we lack the language, it'd say, oh, you're going to harm that person. Well, if they need a good whack, you're not harming them by giving them the good whack. You're helping them by giving them the good whack. And I think that's exactly what Socrates would have said. Treat them justly, in accordance with their own nature. If they've developed a pretty bad nature, well, they might not get they might get rough treatment from a just man.
These are tricky issues to work through. I'm put in mind though of in my traditional karate dojo from my childhood, there were times when we would break the kata into single moves. We just do one move. The whole room, he'd call out, we do the next move, and then we'd hold the posture. And the sensei would walk around taking his time, checking each and every person. And one of the things was your stance deep enough? If you're in a forward stance, your knee is supposed to be so far forward that it's literally over your big toe. And it should cover it. And he'd take the staff with him. And he'd line it up with your knee and he'd drop it. And let me tell you, nobody let the staff fall onto their toe because they didn't have a deep enough stance. You see him coming with the staff, and you look at your knee and go, ooh, I need to bend further because I know what he's about to do. And we'd bend our knee and the staff would drop in front of our toe instead of on our toe. And we're all like, yeah, okay. Even though it wasn't a real threat, even though he never would have broken anybody's toe, just the fact that we were to be put to the test was enough to remind us to check ourselves. And then what that taught us is later he didn't have to bring the staff around. Every time it was, he'd call out the one move and we get into the stance, we'd check our own stance. And if it wasn't deep enough, we'd push that knee further out, even with no immediate threat. We'd internalized the check. And so there's this question of, what does it take to get someone to perform the checks that are necessary for them to be a good person throughout their life? What are all the different parts of their behavior that they're supposed to check? And some people you can teach by telling them that. And some people, it's going to take more than that to teach them to do the necessary checks. And, it's I think the Greeks would say it's a matter of character. What is your character at the moment when you need to learn? Do you have a character that's highly receptive? Or do you have a character that's highly resistant? If it's highly resistant, it's going to be harder for you to learn the lesson. But if you don't learn it, things are going to be so much worse for you later in life as you go about doing terrible things because you never learned to check yourself. Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
So I'm listening to the interesting perspective of 5 males. So being of the other sex, what I know is that it becomes necessary not to defend yourself, as I used to call it, but to be assertive. Because if you're not, you constantly get run over. And I heard what Donald said, that Socrates said he would rather suffer evil than do evil. Is that what he said? Did I interpret that right? And
I think I always should have used the word injustice versus should suffer injustice and then do justice. That would have been what, I don't think Socrates used the word evil or good and evil, but he used just and unjust acts.
well, you kind of preempted what I was going to say, because one of my favorite verses from the Bible comes from Micah, verse 6, where he says, do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. That's how you treat your enemies.
Well, sometimes I'm afraid, Sharon,
Yeah.
that I can justify the Athenians actually executing Socrates, because he really was disruptive. Not in the way they accused him, I don't think, but maybe in a worse way or a more profound way. So
was that their form of justice then?
well, justice, whatever, justice for Plato and Socrates is always treating something in accordance with its nature. So it always involves a judgment about what the nature of person. So I know in something how I would generally treat a human being, because I know there's sort of a human nature, but then there's the peculiarities that they might have that would be their character, that would govern how I wanted to treat them justly. And so in some cases, it only involves human nature. So we'd say, oh, justice is treating everybody the same. And then in other cases, it would be in areas where it depends upon their character, treating everybody differently. And both are justice.
Right.
Because both are sensitive to the concrete nature of who you're acting towards. We're not. This is. I'm going to have to go get a philosophy license or something, making me talk so much here, or prompting
No,
me.
I like it. I like it.
No.
Because-
So it doesn't. So there's no little thing like treat everybody the same, treat everybody different, treat. You can't reduce what Plato, when he discusses justice, and Socrates in the dialogues, to some simple aphorism that can guide you. It must be who is standing in front of you and what do they need? What does their character and nature require of you?
Yeah.
Well said, because that was my entire career. And I already said that the operating room is a pretty combative place.
Yeah.
And when I was leading, I had the attributes of race and sex and foreigner, but I was going to get this right because I understood what was appropriate and what you just said. So I had individuals with different characters and different motives approach a situation, and it was always my option to have the duty of care and to do what was right for that defenseless person sitting there. So, was that justice? Right? Was that I was just, because now you have introduced another factor. You have someone whose entire well-being is dependent on you, the decision that you both are gonna make. And so those decisions coming from either side wholesome, or what was right, or what was beneficial? Those are the questions you had to answer. So I find that experience very interesting viewed through the philosophical lens.
Yeah. This is why the Greeks thought that the meting out of justice was not a matter for most people. It was only a matter for people who actually had an adult mind, because it requires that kind of taste. Kenneth Smith uses that term a lot, taste, as being one of the critical elements of an Aristos, that they are willing to attend to the subtleties and nuances of the concrete situation before them, and not give in to the temptation to just stamp out uniform, prescriptions for everybody. Because everybody, as Donald says, some things in common and some things different. It's complicated. It's complicated.
So I go back to my passage where it says, do justice and love mercy.
Yeah. Thanks, Sharon. Stephen, you're going to get the final say today. Come off.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about Sharon's situation. You're in that operating theatre or whatever, and you're dealing with a lot of complexities, and there's a critical situation there. You're dealing, with a person's health at an extreme level in some cases. And you got the surgeon or whatever taking his temper out on the nurses quite unjustly. But you're stuck in that position where you just have to put up with it.
No.
And you don't.
I'm going to tell you a funny story. At the end, almost at the end of my career, I'm getting ready to retire. And one of the senior surgeons is introducing his young partner. And he says, that's Dr. Townsend over there. And I don't want you to mess with her. So I got up. I said, what kind of introduction is that? He said, I'm giving him a warning because you've been in this hospital 10 years and I've not won an argument with you yet. I want him to look good. So I'm telling him who to stay away from. And I burst out laughing because that was not complimentary. That was definitely not complimentary. But here was he looking out for his junior guy and said, if you're going to go by her, you better have your ducks in a row. And that's what it takes, because I felt, Stephen, that I had that vulnerability, that person who gave me their trust. I had to deal with that to the very, very best of my ability, right, in a way to ensure the best outcome for you. Because we're standing and I can manage our egos. And if I'm the one that's calling the shots, then you got to have a good reason why I need to change.
Right. Right.
And so it's very difficult. So as I said, viewing this through the philosophical lens, as Donald explained it, is interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. It's these kinds of issues that are so paradoxical, where philosophy's usefulness, which Kenneth Smith says it doesn't have, just to dispense with the argument, but its usefulness comes into play most in these kinds of situations, with issues of justice, with issues of long-term strategy, with issues of the things that will not yield to simple evaluation, are where you kind of have to pull out your philosophy and go, well, now kind of dust this thing off.
Yeah. It's very interesting. It was an interesting dynamic, and it made me grow very, very rapidly, because when I started, I was 30. But you got to see the world as a very, very less threatening place.
Yeah.
Because you knew what you could do.
Yeah. Yeah. Courage.
Yes, that's right.
There's a lot of courage bound up in that. So on this note, Donald wants to add something.
Well, it's days like today. I think I told the story of my math professor who said I should forget philosophy, study math, because I'd be through in math by age 25 and I could spend the rest of my life studying philosophy. Well, I didn't do much in math, but days like today show that philosophy you can do as an old man, and it does help sometimes. I think, my ideas on, say, Plato were just sort of, I read a lot of stuff. I haven't actually reread a lot in years, but I read it all at one point and read lots of second stuff. And then it just stews for 40 years or something. And then somebody like Phil pokes you, and holy shit, I do have something to say about that, because I have thought about it. And I've thought about it over and over for years.
Yeah.
And so that's the way of saying thank you, Phil. And
So may
thank
I
you,
ask-
Joseph. Yes,
So
Sharon.
may I ask
Thank you,
one
Val.
quick question before I go? Sorry, Joseph.
Oh, that's good.
The way I'm seeing it, philosophy has principles, lots of principles presented from varying angles. But aren't the judgments ours as different as diverse human beings?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's exactly what there's probably no two words in Kenneth Smith that have puzzled me more for longer than his constant use of connoisseurial taste.
Connoisseurial taste.
What does
You
that mean?
know, it's just like he says, how do you develop? Well, you know, it's like experience. You develop it by making a lot of mistakes or
Yes.
what, and living a long time. And then you sort of, you know, it's like, I don't know. I don't even know if I've ever developed it because I'm not sure I understand, but I do know the importance of judgment. You know, it's why I resent Hannah Arendt for never writing that third chapter, the third book on judgment. Because if you're just dealing with the structure, you're clearly an idealist.
Mhm.
If you're just winging it on the facts, who knows? You may call yourself a pragmatist or an empiric. But to have a structure to your thought and to be able to decide which case is before you, which of this big abstract structure applies to this concrete situation so that you get the what are we going to call it? Self-provident. You get the provident
Yes.
conclusion. Well, you know, I don't know. I mean, that's what you're trying to do.
That's where the whole
But
argument.
it's that judgment,
Yes.
that taste that
Yeah.
has to bring together, because the facts don't say, "Hey, I'm a case of X," or "I'm a
Right.
case of Y."
Right.
And the structure, the thought structure, the logical structure, it has stuff in there for every case. It's not like that. But until you say, this should guide, if I have this case, this should guide me because I've thought through it. That's very difficult. Judgment is everything. Connoisseurial taste.
Yes.
Good.
Connoisseurial taste. I like that.
Yeah.
Well,
Connoisseurial
it showed up about 3 or 4 times already in this.
Kenneth loves that phrase.
Yeah, and because you have part of the choosing what's best for men to do is knowing what you're dealing with, making that, because you've got to choose from the perspectives, you've got to choose from the facts, you've got from the concrete. I don't know. It's too complex. That's
It's not,
why.
because I think as moderns, particularly now, we do not engage that process.
Right. Right. We're always looking
And
for
I-
simple answers.
Always looking for the cookie cutter. And you know, for me, as a physician, the abortion debate exemplifies this. And we're going to be quiet because I guess you want to go now. But that's where that was.
You know, open a can of worms right in the final minute as we're rolling off.
Well,
No, you're right.
It's
Every situation
modern.
is different.
I mean,
right?
it goes right into what Donald was saying. And you know what I think is a big thing for me, judgment.
Yeah.
It's not there. Moderns don't like it
Yeah.
because it forces you to think.
you know,
And it
And
puts you
I-
at risk, right? Because there can be no set of policies that you can point to and say, I'm just a helpless pawn of these policies. If you're exercising judgment, then you're going beyond policy, which means you're sticking your neck out, which means someone can punish you for your decision. They can tell you you did it wrong and you can end up in jail. And people are terrified of that.
Yes. Yes.
Nobody wants to engage in connoisseurial taste and judgment. They want to be helpless pawns of a system and just follow the policy, so that if anyone criticizes them, they say, it's not my fault. I was just following orders. Look, there's a policy. Told me to do that. How could I choose to do otherwise than obey? It's not my fault. Anyway, on that cheery note, let's wrap up. We'll pick up next week in the middle of paragraph 8. And
That was very good. Thank you.
And I'm gonna take some downers of some kind for these.
No, you were great, Donald.
Donald, please, because when you are such a barren slate like I am, I like to hear it.
Oh, really?
So thank you very much.
You're just a pushover for old men.
You're not going to say anything to that.
Good. Good.
Because you just open your mouth and put your foot in.
That's right. That's the way I want you to remember me, Sharon. Foot in the mouth.
And with that, I'll see you. Have a great week, everyone.
All right. Bye-bye.